Jeremy Faulkner had built his life on avoiding risk. A solid civil servant with a humanities degree from Roehampton, he prided himself on being sensible. His wife Caroline agreed, although she sometimes thought that sensible sounded too much like timid. Like Jeremy, she preferred to believe the real description was rational. Every Easter and Christmas, they boarded the train to Caroline's family in the semi-rural north, a ritual that always filled Jeremy with quiet dread. When they arrived at the dreary, semi-detached house in Essex, he'd sit there, jaw clenched, as her brother-in-law extolled the virtues of Margaret Thatcher's replacement, John Major. Any attitude that could be labelled as coming from London, he described as nonsense. The men drank beer, the women prepared trifle, and Jeremy endured. One year, as the room filled with laughter and the faint smell of sausage rolls, he noticed a teenager listening to every word. "So, young man," Jeremy asked stiffly, "which university will you be applying to?" The boy looked at him calmly. "None. I want to start my own business." Jeremy huffed. "A business? Risky. Better to join the civil service, steady, pensioned, safe." The boy smiled. "No risk of failure. Big risk of missing out on success." Jeremy was surprised by that answer. It was more sophisticated than he imagined could ever come from the lips of an Essex lad. Jeremy felt the urge to lecture him, but Caroline's hand on his arm stopped him. Later, on the train home, he sighed with relief. "Ignorance," he muttered. "That kid thinks risk is noble. It's stupidity." When there was a run on the Northern Rock Bank, Caroline worried excessively about their financial future. She stewed on too many unanswered questions. How bad will the crisis get? Will we still have our pensions when we retire? What's going to happen to the National Health Service? Jeremy scolded her gently. "Stop thinking like that and listen to the experts, darling. That's what they're there for. They're on the TV every night." Years later, Caroline's health began to fail. Her doctor said it was her heart. He murmured something about years of stress or exposure to toxins. Clearly, he wasn't sure of the cause and was offering explanations to help her hold on to some possible explanation. Jeremy became increasingly concerned. There was a growing likelihood that Caroline would leave her job. At work, Jeremy dismissed the new obsession of his young colleagues, crypto. "A scam," he declared in the break room. "The BBC did a whole program on it. Did you see it?" The presenter exposed it beautifully. They smiled politely, in their understated British way, trying to avoid conflict, and went back to their screens. One evening, in a modest restaurant in North London, Jeremy overheard a man at the next table discussing Britain's dire economic situation. He referred to some fellow he'd seen on YouTube. Jeremy had heard enough. He pretended to be speaking to Caroline, but his comment was loud enough for his neighbour to hear. "Utter rubbish. Another fraud on Tic-Tac." The stranger huffed and twisted in his chair to see who had interrupted his private conversation. "Do you mean TikTok? I was referring to an economist on YouTube. I'll give you his name if you like. You might learn something." Jeremy bristled. "I understand economics." Caroline had bowed her head in embarrassment. Now, the stranger had turned directly towards Jeremy. "I bet you think prices are rising. Actually, the pound is falling. It's collapsed 95% since the 1970s. Jeremy had no words to respond. He could only stare at his half-eaten dinner. Caroline wanted to escape, so she did. She abruptly stood up and left the restaurant. Jeremy found her waiting on the pavement outside, having hurriedly paid the bill. She said, "Why did you do that? Why have an argument with a stranger on our night out?" The years blurred. Inflation gnawed at Jeremy's pension. His savings shrank. His flat in East Ham, London, seemed to grow smaller and more dismal. His heating bills loomed larger. During this miserable time, the words of the teenager all those years ago came back to haunt him. The kid knew about downside risk, but he understood upside risk, the risk of not improving your situation. Then, Caroline's health took a turn for the worse. In a shocking set of events, her illness worsened, and after long months of waiting for a specialist's appointment, she was gone. Her waxy face resting on a hospital pillow was Jeremy's last image of his dear departed wife. He sold their flat in East Ham and moved to a grey block in a busy and noisy part of Finsbury Park. In winter, he kept the heating turned low to save on electricity. Sometimes he would catch his increasingly gaunt reflection in a dark window. The sensible man, who had always believed the experts, was watching his own life erode incrementally, one overly cautious decision at a time. When Caroline's family invited him to a memorial lunch a year after her death, he hesitated. The ticket price for the train journey alone felt extravagant, but guilt and loneliness pushed him to take the journey to Essex. The town looked just as it had years before. Caroline's relatives looked the same but older, more stooped, more haggard. But there was one face that was new, or rather, grown up. The quiet teenager from years ago, now a man of 35, was tall, confident, with an accent that had the hallmarks of New York City. "Jeremy Faulkner," he said warmly. "It's been years." "Good heavens," Jeremy said, squinting. "You're Tom, isn't it?" "Tom Walker. You told me once I should join the civil service." Jeremy smiled awkwardly. "Ah, yes. Good advice, I hope?" Tom grinned. "I did the opposite. I'm working in risk management. Just about to start my own firm in Midtown Manhattan." "Still taking risks then?" Jeremy said dryly. "Always," Tom replied. "Calculated ones that are more on the upside than the downside." Over the next hour, Tom spoke confidently about his life in New York. He'd just bought an apartment in the East Village. He described markets, currencies, and hedge funds. Jeremy half listened, half envied. Tom was everything he was not: confident, worldly, unafraid. When Tom rose to leave, he slipped a business card into Jeremy's hand. "If you ever want to make your money work harder, give me a call. You might even enjoy a little risk." Jeremy forced a laugh. "I think those days are behind me." Back in his flat at Finsbury Park, Jeremy sat morosely in front of his television set. His pension barely covered rent and food now. The BBC News was full of talk about the pound hitting historic lows. The coupon returns on government gilts were soaring, always a bad sign, and digital currencies replacing fiat money at a rate that made Jeremy's head spin. Then, he found Tom's business card in his coat pocket. That afternoon, he searched for Tom's company name using one of the free internet computers in the N4 Public Library near the Seven Sisters Road. Tom's impressive website appeared instantly. On impulse, Jeremy sent a cautious email. "Dear Tom, I'm afraid I find myself in some financial difficulty. You once offered to advise me. I'd be grateful to take you up on it." The reply came within hours. "Of course. I'll call you at 1 o'clock, your time tomorrow morning. You deserve some good fortune." The phone conversation lasted an hour. Tom's voice was positive, soothing, full of American terms that Jeremy barely understood. "You've got a modest pension fund, right? We can transfer part of it into a digital asset, regulated, insured, minimal risk, maximum potential." Jeremy hesitated. "Is that crypto? I thought that was..." Tom laughed. "It's nothing like a meme coin. This is a stable coin called RLUSD, government-backed. It's created by Ripple, and it pairs with XRP on the blockchain. It's what the smart institutions are doing behind the scenes. They lend out their stablecoin and are paid interest on their holdings. It would be wise to become involved before the pound collapses completely and the IMF has to bail out Britain again. At that point, you'll lose everything. The risk is all on the downside if you hold pounds." Jeremy barely had an idea what Tom was talking about. When he finished stuttering, Tom took over the conversation. "I'll set up an account for you and top it up so you can see some real benefit. You can pay me back from your profits." After Jeremy hung up, he became increasingly nervous. He thought he'd ring Tom back and say that he'd changed his mind. But he didn't. He simply sat in his chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the television. He barely knew what show flickered in front of his eyes. Weeks dragged by, but Jeremy held back from ringing Tom. No doubt these things took time to arrange. Anyway, he didn't want to look like a fool. He was embarrassed enough as it was. Then, a letter dropped into the wireframe that was attached inside his front door. It was a statement from his bank. His balance had risen. Not much. About £100. Jeremy was flustered. Then, he wondered whether it could be something to do with Tom in New York. He headed out to the N4 library and emailed Tom. The reply he received lifted his spirits tremendously. Tom had topped up Jeremy's account by $5,000. Jeremy could expect another £100 or so in a couple of weeks. Tom wrote, "I know it's not a lot, but I hope every little bit helps. You can start paying me back in a couple of years." Jeremy expressed his heartfelt thanks, and when he returned to his flat, he turned the electric heater up a notch or two. It was worth the risk.